Okay.
Yeah, well, no, we made antibodies.
Were they made against particular small segments or the whole protein?
We had the entire gene sequence. We were able to select the target based on the gene sequence and see that. So if you don't have the gene sequence, that would be a problem.
It's almost better to just be gone.
So if he's not that, then there can be some decisional to choose a sequence, at which point then you start to use it.
Yes.
It's expensive.
I know. And it overlaps with the week my kids' school starts, and all three of my children are going in early. We start very early, but we get out very early. We're out before Memorial Day.
Work you beat.
And now I'm going to do it with
Hi, everyone. Welcome to our panel for this evening, Primates, Voles, and Worms. My name is Cara Parisien, and I'm a graduate from the law school at University of Montreal. So I'm really happy to be here. I will start by introducing all of the speakers. So this is Dr. Alex Ophir. He spoke earlier today. This is Dr. Hendricks, Michael Hendricks. Then we have, my apologies, we have Kristin Andrews, as well as Sarah Brosnan and Mary Lee Jensvold. Thanks, everyone, for being here. I guess I'll start off by saying each of you have a few minutes if you want to just summarize what you talked about earlier, or yeah.
I wasn't prepared. So I guess very briefly, my talk, if you missed it, was focused on understanding the choices, so to speak, that individual male prairie voles make when, in terms of how to pursue mates, the tactics that they choose. And my main argument was that things like knowing who and where your neighbors are and being able to use that information is really important to informing those kinds of decisions in a way such that spatial memory, social memory, and that level of cognition is really important for making other kinds of decisions like mating choices. Done.
I just finished talking about worms, so I don't know if anyone just came in. It was about worms, and it was about how even an animal as simple as a worm with a few hundred neurons, just to be able to behave and interact in a useful way with the world, has to have primitive forms of representation of itself and its nervous system in order to integrate sort of its behavior with its sensory environment. So that was kind of the main thing.
And I gave a talk last night about the other minds, the problem of other minds, and mind reading, and whether there are better alternative explanations than the mind reading explanation for passing the theory of mind task. And I suggested that maybe we have some markers for sentience that might work for mammals, and maybe they'd work for worms too. I don't know.
I'm Sarah Brosnan, and I spoke this morning, and I am interested in how individuals make decisions about who to cooperate with and when to cooperate and when to stop cooperating. I'm particularly interested in how reward outcomes will influence that. And I talked mostly about non-human primates today, and I have studied 9 species of those, but I also actually work with reptiles and with human primates. So I have a little bit to say about those, but not as much.
Hi, my name is Mary Lee Jensvold, and I didn't give a talk, but my work is with chimpanzees that use American Sign Language, and so chimpanzee behavior and communication and other non-human primates.
Okay, let me launch it. Could you please talk to us about oxytocin outside of the vole ambit, namely oxytocin in other creatures and how it might be related to human empathy for non-human species?
Oh man. Yes. So I think I'll start by qualifying what I'm about to say with, you should ask the same question of Larry Young.
I will.
I suspect you will. And you'll get, in many ways, a much deeper answer. But I think there'll be a lot of similarities in what we'll probably say, and maybe a few differences. With that question, what I like to do is I want to start with not talking about oxytocin outside of a vole, but inside the cell of any animal. I think that's a really important place to start with what does oxytocin do, because for me, I have a real pet peeve when I hear people talk about oxytocin as the cuddle hormone and things like that. Because what oxytocin is effectively doing is at the cellular level, it is it's a G protein coupled receptor, and it can do a lot of things within the cell that basically create signal cascades of cellular interactions. At the cellular level, it's a neuromodulator because what it's effectively doing is increasing or decreasing, you can think of it, the probability of a neuron firing. And in many ways, what oxytocin is doing, based on some work actually out of hippocampal literature, outside of the social behavior world, is tweaking the signal to noise of a cell. By which I mean, you can get, when neurons fire, sometimes they sort of will be firing in ways that are sort of highly coordinated or a little bit messy. And oxytocin actually really tightens that up. And so I think that that's really important because when you sort of extend sort of what it's doing at the cellular level out to a behavioral level, you can think of it also as acting as a signal to noise reducer. And so when you hear about the functions that oxytocin has on increasing trust in humans, so humans can play a game, you can give humans a little intranasal spritz, like a little inhaler's worth of oxytocin, and have them play a trust game. This game would be something like, if Michael and I are playing, there's two roles. I'm given $10, and then I'm able to split that $10. I can give 0 to all 10 of them to him, at which point then he gets to sort of multiply it by some number, maybe 3, he gets $30, and now he can then reciprocate and give back any or all of those $30 that he now has. So there's basically a trust element to my role where I say, okay, I think you're gonna give me a nice big fair share, some of the things that Sarah's talked about, and we do, as we humans have an innate sense of what is fair, and we'll punish people for not providing that amount. But if I take oxytocin, I'm much more willing to give a larger amount of that money in the trust. It doesn't change the way he would play the game in reciprocating, but it does change the way I do it. And you can think about that as sort of tweaking the noise. So on the one hand, it's enhancing trust. On the other hand, it's tweaking the signal to noise. It's increasing or decreasing the probability that I think I'm going to get a bad outcome. I'm going to get a good outcome in this trust. But it also does other things in that are so it's associated with a lot of these pro-social behaviors. You do get a lot of that pro-social behavior that you see in voles, that we talk about in voles, in humans, things that are very similar to these things, social attraction and things like that. Trust is another one. But you also get, there's a dark side of it as well. So you can have in-groups and you can have out-groups. And your trust of in-groups might be increased by oxytocin, but your trust of out-groups is decreased. And again, you can view that as a signal-to-noise relationship, where I'm increasing my trust of knowns, but I'm decreasing my trust of unknowns. So getting rid of some of the noise, some of that variation that's out there on the edge. And so I think it's really important to think about that it's not just in the terms of social behavior, it does this in memory as well. You can increase memory where you can and tweak the amount of sort of fuzziness on the fringes of memory, where you can have a very clear memory and stamp it in versus have a fuzzier memory and so on. What I mean to say is good associations, weak associations are more easily or more difficultly made, based on sort of function of oxytocin in many capacities. So I'm a bit rambling here, but I guess I don't like to view, while oxytocin is very important for pro-social behavior and social behaviors in general, I don't like to simply just think of it as a one-off, oh, it's a social behavior hormone. It's doing something much deeper than that I think can be much broader. You can sort of, to do a quick, I'll sort of finish with this thought, which is just a quick analogy. A lot of people like to talk about corticosterone or cortisol as being the stress hormone, but it's not. It's an energy mobilization hormone. Right, and sometimes stress is involved, and sometimes arousal is involved, and all of that. But we like to sort of draw these sort of shortcut terms to think about them more easily. Oxytocin is not a cuddle hormone or necessarily even a pro-social hormone, but it is something that is highly associated with those kinds of embodiments. Does that help a little with that question?
Yeah, I have something to add that's not even going to be as deep as Alex's because I do not study it as much. But there's been a lot of work recently trying to replicate some of that human sort of cuddle hormone function with the primates. Let's give exogenous oxytocin to primates and see how they respond. And I've done a little bit of it. It's fairly easy to train a non-human primate to sit still and accept an infusion of intranasal oxytocin. And virtually all of those studies have found absolutely nothing. Now, one possibility is that we aren't actually we're not using the right metrics to look for some of these prosocial behaviors, but another possibility is that it really isn't changing anything. In my lab, we have at least managed to look at whether or not it is changing their circulating oxytocin levels, not their central ones, because we won't do spinal taps in the lab, so I can't look at the central ones. And it is, and it's changing it on the same rate that you see if they've just been in a grooming session, which is a natural endogenous oxytocin releaser. So I don't think it's that it's not, the oxytocin isn't getting in there. So I think we need to be a lot more careful about whether we assume that, oh, look, you give somebody a little spritz of oxytocin and it makes them magically more trusting or whatever. We are seeing, however, in some of the wild studies, if you look at changes in oxytocin that were endogenous after certain levels of social behavior, you do see bigger changes. So it's not that it's not related, it's just that giving them a spritz of oxytocin doesn't seem to be enough to do it.
And I'll add on just to this idea of the intranasal delivery method. That's something that has come under criticism. It's, in the first place, we don't know the mechanism of how intranasal oxytocin does anything. We don't know how it gets into the brain. There is evidence from a few labs, like the Inga Newman out in Germany has shown a few years back, if you do sampling directly from a rat brain after giving them really high doses of intranasal oxytocin, you do get changes in oxytocin levels in the brain. But it's got to be really high doses. So it can do something. Now, is it direct? Is it indirect? We don't know. That's $1 million question for the intranasal non-peptide world. And people are really trying to figure that out because we do use it therapeutically in humans, and we're using it experimentally in various primates, human and non-human, and in non-primates like vampire bats, for example, and prairie voles, and things like that. And we do see effects. The question is are you affecting something peripherally, which then has some kind of indirect feedback? And if you don't care about the mechanism, then maybe that's okay or not. But it is important to know that, yeah, and maybe part of the replication problem is because the mechanism of how it affects things is so unknown. One of the things that one of my graduate students who's just writing up this final chapter of his dissertation did some intranasal oxytocin. Oh, sorry, no, it's a different graduate student who's not writing up her dissertation. She's in her second year. But she did an experiment where we looked at the difference between chronic delivery and acute delivery of oxytocin and vasopressin on spatial memory. And what we found is if you give it acute, that is a single spritz, and then you train them and then you on the water maze, and then you give them a spritz and you say, does that improve or inhibit their memory? Acute, whether it's oxytocin or vasopressin delivery, doesn't do anything. If you do it chronic, so developmentally, you give it to them for a series of days when they're young, then they get old, then you train them on the memory test, and then you test them and that's it. With oxytocin, over development, you get nothing. But with vasopressin, you actually do get a change in spatial memory ability. And so this is an interesting interface, in my opinion, where developmentally you can have, if you give it repeated exposures over important developmental years, you can actually change the natural native expression of the way your brain would wire up, and that will change your behavior. Activating it after a single shot on something as simple as this may not be enough, and I think that it probably is broad. So I think that how you use it is important, and when you use it is also important and all that. And I guess sort of one of the take-home messages is activational, no big deal, but if you're giving kids, if you're treating autistic kids, for example, with oxytocin because you think that's going to increase their prosocial behavior, and they're really young and they're developing, what are you really doing to their brain?
What triggers the release
of oxytocin? A lot of things. In pregnant women, oxytocin is released during contraction, lactation, so nursing will release oxytocin. Touch, hugging, gaze, so eye-to-eye contact. Your pets can actually induce a release of oxytocin in you, and you potentially in them, if it's the right kind of pet. That was yesterday, right, when we were talking about birds and dogs, and yeah. So a dog very well may have a release of oxytocin when it looks at you, and vice versa. Stroking the pet, that touch can release a lot of oxytocin. So it is released by physical contact and things like that pretty readily. Yeah.
And how long does it last when it's released?
Yeah. I don't know the answer to how long does the effects of oxytocin last. I don't know that answer.
Hi, my name is Pascal Collin. I'm a student. I have a question for Dr. Hendricks. I was wondering if in the worms, does oxytocin affects worms in any way, and as well if you could see like cooperative behavior within the worms, and if not, like do you think like the fact that they're hermaphrodites like has to play in the fact that it's not?
So worms have a lot of neuropeptides. Many of them are nonapeptides. Some are evolutionarily related to oxytocin and all these. It's interesting. The worm has 302 neurons. It has almost 250 neuropeptides. So I think they really underscores the centrality of neuromodulation and peptides to controlling behavior and controlling behavioral states. So we don't understand that system as well as we do the sort of synaptic connections between neurons. So if you look at this is a little off topic what you asked, but it's interesting. If you look at where neuropeptides are expressed and you look where their receptors are expressed, that sort of network you get out of that looks nothing like the anatomical synaptic network. So clearly there's a lot of interesting stuff going on. In terms of social behaviors, worms have some things that are called social behaviors. Some strains are called social feeders because they clump together to feed. It turns out probably everyone's trying to lower the amount of ambient oxygen, and the easiest way to do that is to get in a pile of worms. So it's not clear that they're actually social. That said, they do constitutively release pheromones, and those pheromones have two well-described functions. One is that worms measure population density by how much pheromone they encounter in their environment. And this changes some developmental decisions and some behavior. And then, as I mentioned, 1 in 1,000 worms by accident is a male. Unlike hermaphrodites, males have to mate in order to pass on any genes. And so males use pheromones to try to find hermaphrodites. So mating is really the only truly social behavior they have. Some of these other feeding things are probably secondary. All of them involve neuropeptides.
Can I just say one little short thing, which is the emergence of cooperation of any form isn't contingent on an oxytocin-like peptide acting, right? I mean, we see a lot of correlations and a lot of influences of oxytocin in mammals and other species. But you can look at other animals, or even like not quite animals like slime mold, where there's high degrees of cooperation, or what we would view as an outsider looking in as potential cooperation, where as far as I know, oxytocin or an oxytocin-like molecule is not necessarily operating. So I think it's, you don't, again, the warning is don't equate oxytocin with this behavior per se.
The normal next step is to ask panelists to interact with one another. Whenever this was a hiatus question.
Something you said about oxytocin decreasing the trust to outgroup, like a trigger question to me. I'm sorry I don't have the reference, but I've read somewhere that human parents, when they just have a baby, like new parents are more suspicious of outgroups. They're more protective. So I was wondering if you have observed the same thing in non-human primates or voles, if like new parents, mother or father in the case of voles, or more suspicious of outgroup, or yeah.
Sure. Well, in general, non-human primates would typically be suspicious of outgroup members, especially if they're the opposite sex, because if you're a female who just had a baby and a new male is taking over, that new male will likely commit infanticide if it takes over in the group. So females they don't like it when new males come in. And of course, the males in most of these species don't have a whole lot to do with the infants per se. They're not really doing much one-on-one parenting, but they don't want the new males to come in either for the same reason. I have no idea if that's oxytocin mediated, but it strikes me as one of those things that's pretty basic, so it probably doesn't need any sort of hormonal trigger. Now, some of them are seasonal breeders, but a lot of them aren't. So there would be just generally a disinterest in having new individuals come in, but of course they do anyway. And usually when that happens, that's when you see these issues.
Can I reframe it as maybe not just outgroup members, but let's say if they just after birth they could be closer or more trusting of their close social partners, and the more peripheral partners of the group they would be more suspicious. Like so, everybody's remains still in group, but just the social distance could be affected.
Yeah, they tend to stay closer with their friends, what I would call friends, the individuals they would typically spend more time with. So you wouldn't necessarily have peripheral and central members. It would just be who you personally spend more time with.
Can I ask a question about that?
Mm-hmm.
So are there notable differences in primates that are cooperative breeders, like marmosets, in things like oxytocin systems compared to others?
Well, there's this weird little quirk that some of the New World monkeys have, this funky oxytocin. So there's the mammalian consensus, and then there's the prolinate substitution, oxytocin for New World monkeys. And as far as I know, nobody's figured out why. Karen Parker found that not that long ago, in the last 5 to 8 years. And there is still some debate. It looks like the mammalian consensus might work with the New World monkeys, but not as well. Jeff French has some good data on that. He's done a lot of that. And so the big question is, why do they have a different one? Is it just a random mutation, or is it actually a meaningful selective event? And we don't know the answer to that question.
But I would say that, I'm such a fan of the work that Jeff's done along those lines,
right.
and I'm my memory of it. And what I remember, I remember feeling very compelled by the story that, so there's this, so you can probably speak to this better than I can, but the idea of how New World monkeys got here in the first place. Did they, cross over a land bridge, or did they come on a floating island and all of that? And it's certainly possible that there was a mutation event that happened in that sort of initial sort of coming to the New World. Because when you see a majority of the New World monkeys have this expression, and you don't see it in Old World monkeys and apes, although maybe you see it in one ape or something like that.
I
can't remember.
So, but
or maybe it's one. Anyway, it's mostly conserved in the New World, so suggesting it's a very derived genetic phenomenon. What's really interesting is it also tends to, and maybe it's all correlational, but interesting fact about New World monkeys, of course, is that a lot of them are highly paternal and tend to have a polyandrous mating system where you'll have one female and maybe two males, and then males are doing pretty much all the heavy lifting of parental care, to the point where, like, historically, when they were being sort of sorted out by experimenters, they said, oh, well, the adult and the baby's clearly the mom, put them together, and then the babies would starve, and they thought, oh, that's the dad. And they learned that the hard way, and then they have never made that mistake again, because it's the dads that are doing all this work. And it's possible that oxytocin mutation is also sort of associated with some of that. So I think that's really, I just find that so compelling and so interesting, that there is this interesting correlation where it's almost like if you take the sort of caricature of what oxytocin is doing and you sort of take it to the next level out extreme, that's the New World monkey version of it.
And capuchins are an interesting sort of corollary to that, because they don't have the monogamy and they don't have the biparental care, but they do have particularly high levels of paternal care. So it's typically one or two males in a group, but often those males are highly tolerant of offspring. They tend to let them play on them. They'll share food with them. Females have been known to allo-nurse each other's offspring. So there's always this big question about the capuchin monkeys. Depending on what you're arguing for, they either do fit into this sort of cooperative breeding model or they don't. But they still show this weird behavior. Now, it's also the case that in capuchins, males typically stay the alpha male for a fairly long period of time, and it differs pretty substantially between the gracile and the robust capuchins. But they have some very interesting parental behaviors. We don't see the male aggression except when a new male takes over the group, in which case we see infanticide.
I have a question, actually. So my question is, after having heard each other speak and learning a little bit more about each other's research topics, was there anything that surprised you, either in how similar it was to your own research interests or in how different, how it contradicted in some way?
Well, I'll say something, because I didn't go to all the talks. I confess I just came, but the work with the worms, to me, and I work with chimpanzees, so, difference in complexity, but that work, we're always, the reason we ask a lot of these things is we're looking for the biological roots of behavior as a primatologist. That's a lot of what we're interested in. And you see this stuff running so deep, and it's just, things that are like correlates of decision making is what you're calling it. So I noticed that conversation that followed was about sort of the haves or the have-nots. And the question is, where are we going to draw the line? And I love it, because you're like, what? And that's the way I am. It's like, what? Why do we have to have lines? Why can't we just talk about continuities of behavior and patterns of behavior? Because that's what we would expect to find, and that's what we're finding. And to me, it's just so refreshing to see it, and to see it on so many different levels,
I think that's true. And one appreciation you get working with worms is how ancient all these systems are. The basic neurotransmitter systems and the basic aspects of neurophysiology and neuropeptide systems, they're so old. And it's true that, like, we shouldn't call a peptide the cuddle hormone, because molecules are just molecules. They can't mean anything by themselves. They can only produce something in context with, depending on the receptor, depending on the neural circuit or brain region it's in. But we do see these things that sort of have this millions of years continuity, where there's the way serotonin affects behavior in C. elegans, and that you can give them Prozac and change their behavior in ways that are systematically measurable, even though they aren't things where you can say this worm was depressed then it wasn't, or something like that. These systems are so conserved because they work, and they've been elaborated on in more complex animals, but they're really elaborations of the same components.
Yeah, I guess I'll agree with sort of that. So I'm in my talk I sort of concluded with the 3 of the 4 levels of analysis that Tim Bergen is so famous for discussing. And the 4th, which I left off my talk only because I didn't have anything to talk about it specifically in this context, is the comparative method, that is looking across taxonomic groups and looking for similarities and looking for differences. And the thing that strikes me is that some of the work that Sarah was talking about, because you're non-invasive, which is amazing, you were able to do some truly behavioral work, beautiful behavioral work that speaks to some levels of mechanism and some levels of adaptive function. And at some level, you can't quite get to some of the other things, but that's where folks like me come in, where we can do some of that and provide some of those kinds of insights that probably how they're also working to sort of help give a sense of the intact animal at the primate level, at the rodent level, and then down to the worm level as well. Because I think, like you just said, I mean, what do you have, like 300 neurons or whatever, but the way each of those neurons work is largely the same as the billions that we have in our brains. And I think that sort of learning to sort of identify those baselines where you can draw a line, if you sort of imagine a plot where you put all possible animals in the world that exist, and you plot sort of particular a mechanism of action and then the behavior, and sort of get a sense of sort of what those relationships are. This is very sort of vague and conceptual. If you have a big scatter plot of dots, you get some kind of baseline regression that you could look at. And that baseline is sort of that similarity, that sort of starting point. And the deviations, when some animals are a little bit further away in one direction or another, tell you where evolution is pushing it, right? And I think that that's really important. And when you talk about the level of, a worm, a vole, and a primate, it really sort of puts into perspective how important that comparative method is, and how you can approach really important big idea questions like what is, sentience and consciousness and cognition and all of these things, if you're able to sort of step back and look at multiple animals from multiple angles and use them in different ways to understand these same problems from different perspectives.
Yeah, just to add to that, I was actually thinking when you were talking that I routinely am spending time saying to people, you should be looking at what these primates are doing. And I know it's not a sense of fairness or a full-blown system or morality, but it tells us something about how ours evolved. And you were doing the same thing with the worm. I mean, it's just, it's backing it up a step.
Couple steps.
Couple.
Very much following on this discussion, actually, I was thinking of sort of outlier individuals in species. So like a parrot that can come up with novel phrases, or a dog that understands 1,000 words, and sort of the analogy to like a human who can understand gravitational waves. Like to the nearest 100, those species can't do those things. Like humans don't understand quantum physics. Parrots can't come up with their own jokes. But you get enough data and you do see these cases. So I'm thinking, like, particularly in the case of higher apes and learned languages, like sign language, when you have the cases of these individuals that seem to have these capacities that wouldn't manifest or wouldn't be used in their own species. You'd have this like lone individual with nobody to communicate with, like the lone quantum physicist who doesn't have any conspecific human who can explain these concepts to. Is it more like just a really stretched continuum, or does it feel more like this is sort of a quantum leap of this is an ability that really doesn't manifest in conspecific cases, but because humans are looking for these close to our abilities in other species, we find these sort of 1 in a million seemingly alien capacities in other species?
Can I answer that? So I don't think that the chimps that are signing are geniuses. And if you took a trip to Africa and you spent time in a community of wild chimps, you would see that they're all gesturing. They're gesturing using a repertoire of gestures that's unique to that community. So, it's not teaching a dog to fly. Dogs don't have wings. Chimps have hands. They have all of the all of the biological basis to do it. And in fact, now we know essentially it's the same phenomena. So the chimps are using gestures with each other in the wild. They're learning them from the others in their community. So with the signing chimps and other language projects, it's the same same kind of phenomena, at least where they're learning it in like Coco would be another example. So I don't think that they're one-offs, and I don't think that they're super geniuses. It gets into another kind of an issue, is that a lot of research is like, well, the encultured apes do better at certain tasks, and that's simply because they've been living in an environment that's stimulated versus an individual that's raised in a lab. The nervous system has to be stimulated in order to develop properly. So that's sometimes in the past, researchers have said, well, enculturated apes are doing these super genius kinds of things. It's a one-off, but the behavior is already there of using gestures and learning. And then also, I think that coupled with that, you have individuals that were raised in enriched environments, which is the kind of environment you would have in the wild, but you don't have that environment in a lab. And so you have individuals that are deprived. They're not functioning normally because of this deprivation. But does that answer your question?
Yeah, a lot of it.
And
Can I ask a question about Coco, actually? So
Yeah.
First, she recently died, which I thought was really sad. But some of the things that she did seem to require symbolic language, like telling a joke, and some things like wanting a pet cat also seemed like acquired from being around humans, maybe. But I was also thinking how much of the way Coco learned to think and interact with people was dependent on language in a way that maybe even a human who never learned language wouldn't have those capacities as well. I wonder,
Yeah, no, I mean, language affects how you perceive your world and how you interact with your world. We know that with humans. And I would argue the same for chimps. I mean, she was a cultural being. She was raised in this culture and included sign language and cats, and because that's what was in her world and came to her world, or she seemed to like them. And so, yeah, I mean, cultural beings, and that affects how they are and who you are after you have this lifelong of experience. Is that?
Yeah, I think. Am I crazy to think my cat has a sense of humor?
Oh, well, so and the humor thing. I mean, even so chimps without sign language do things that, you're playing a game of chase, and then they double back, and you're left in the dust, and they start laughing. So that's humor, and humor is about being surprised and the unexpected. And so maybe you could play tricks on the worms, but it's about unexpected things happening. And so it doesn't take language. I would argue it doesn't take language to make humor.
And I just wanted to pick up on the individual differences thing. They have individual differences just like we do. So it wouldn't, they're not clones of one another. So just like not everybody here is going to swim like Michael Phelps or write like J.K. Rowling or anything else. We have some individuals who like some tasks better than others. They like some individuals better than others. Some of them like to be outside in a social group, and some of them prefer to be off on their own, doing their own thing. And these are all perfectly normal animals who were raised from birth in a social environment, and we have a very enriched environment for them. So you expect to see differences, which is why you test as many of them as you can. So I don't find it surprising at all that some of them are different, and it may not even be an intelligence thing so much as just an interest thing. If they're not interested in participating in the task, they're not going to. So you have to be careful when you're trying to disentangle those things.
Hi, my name is Laurence Gagnon. I also had a question about the use of ASL by apes. I was wondering if you see the same use about it for syntactic use, if there's a structure that you can perceive, or if they can use more grammatical sign like for or because, if they use those kind of signs, or if it's just nouns or.
Yeah. Okay. So ASL is a language that's heavily modulated, so you change the way that the signs are. It's a lot like French Sign Language.
If you see a kind of a structure, a syntactic structure, or Yeah.
Yes, there is evidence for word order. You can different kinds of questions will elicit different orders of signs. But ASL is a language that relies heavily on modulation, and that's modulation is one of the grammatical techniques in American Sign Language, and you do see the chimps doing that as well. So they'll change the place where signs are made. They'll change the form of the sign in the same ways that we see human signers using those grammatical kinds of techniques. And the second part of your question, is it just nouns? No, we can look at the categories, and do you see nouns, you see verbs, and you see what we would call markers. Yes. So you see different kinds of signs in different categories.
And another question about that. Do you see verb agreement with eye gaze, for example, or with position of the body?
Verb agreement with the eye gaze, is that something that you see
in ASL? Yeah.
I'm not familiar with that. Yeah.
Okay, well, thank you.
Well, another question based on that other question. Would you say that they can make propositions with truth values, as far as you could tell?
So you mean, can they tell me something about their world?
I guess, yeah.
Yeah. I mean, they do all the time. So I can walk by, Tatu's looking at a magazine, and what's a picture of a tree? She can tell me that's a tree.
That's a tree, okay.
Yeah, well, they ask questions. So if you're asking about the communicative function of their signs, they have a variety of different communicative function, including referential. And
therefore they could use that to teach something to someone else, to teach, just like we do in school, right?
Well, you're getting into another question of pedagogical style, and so there is evidence that you get that kind of demonstration. Christophe Bosch talks about that. The bulk of learning does seem to be more imitative, watching what's going on in your environment rather than sitting in this kind of a situation. But I would ask you to look cross-culturally in how learning happens. So if you look cross-culturally, this is a different kind of a learning style than an apprenticeship kind of learning style. I'm sure you guys might have things to add to that.
Thank you. I think Stephen wants to say something.
I know where that question came from, so I'm going to follow up on Michelle's question. If they have propositions, as you say, propositions that have values true and false, and that affirm something, why, and this is not facetious, I adore those chimps, and I think they're geniuses. Why aren't they here talking about it with us, or signing about this with us?
Well, one reason is because I don't think you would want one of them in here.
That's not the kind of answer I want.
Emotional beings, and they're very strong. Well, they don't engage in the same kind of interactions that we do in terms of.
And what does that mean?
What does it mean? I don't know. For me, my approach is rather than get into questions of have and have not. I just talk about what it is that they're doing, and then the only marker we have is, well, what are humans doing, and do we see, because humans are the only other languaging beings that and we can look at similarities and differences in those patterns. Do we see the same kinds of patterns going on?
I know that you are a partisan of continuity, and so am I. We all want to be continuous with with other species. But there's something here, and we can't treat it as if it weren't there. By the way, I want to make an analogy. The question of language and the question of sentience, not the usual stupid idea that you have to have language in order to be sentient, but there's a question about whether it's discontinuous or not. Is it the case? I mean, one of the things that came up in the sessions this morning is that perhaps all animals are sentient. And that is just a continuous matter. And yet it still leaves you with the question, where and how and why in evolution would the capacity to feel have arisen? But that's sentience, and I'm not talking about that, I'm making an analogy. The same thing is true about language. And my question about why they're not here talking about this with us is not just a sociological or a cultural question. One of the features that language has, and what makes a proposition, is that in any language, sign language, French, German, Swahili, you can say anything. You can make any proposition. That means if the chimpanzees have that, they can say anything too. Why don't they?
Well, I guess you mean why don't they come to workshops and
No,
interact?
that's a cultural question. Why can't they?
Why can't they? Or do you mean why don't all chimps use sign language?
Why doesn't any chimp that uses sign language enter into a microcosm, say a 4-year-old's version of our conversation now?
Yeah, I mean, look, I'm not saying that they are humans. I certainly am not. And I think that we need to move away from thinking that, what we're doing is something that our species is particularly evolved. I mean, we have these giant cortexes. We are highly adapted for speech and comprehension of vocal information. I'm not denying that we are not a specialized critter, but I also think that there's lots of other very specialized critters. A worm swinging their head around and doing what they do, I guess we think that it's something lowly, it's something below us, it's something down, but they're equally as adapted for their environment as we are adapted to ours with our biology. And so we have to appreciate that each species is adapted to the world that they live in, and we are adapted to what humans do. Chimps are not humans.
What if you don't consider my question a question about chimps, but a question about language and whether they have it? What I've been describing now is properties of language. Syntax is not that interesting. And they do have syntax, primitive syntax, in response to that question. But what I was describing, which is the transparent power, just like when you have once you have an organism that feels, that opens up the entire universe of potential feelings, not necessarily for that organism, but if you're feeling, then in principle you can feel anything, right? Not that organism, but the modality of feeling is possessed by that organism. What about language? If you really have language, shouldn't they be doing more with it than they seem to be? Because with all my admiration of chimps, I'm highly skeptical about the fact that what they have is language.
Well, you're getting hung up on the term language, and I would argue, I can flip this around. I mean, it's the same thing is going to happen with sentience. The same thing is going to happen with feeling. To say, well, is it language or not? For me, you could get a million different definitions of language. So then you could get into a whole conversation about what language is. And so rather than go down that route, I just talk about what it is that they do. I find that far more interesting, far more productive, and I think in terms of any kind of phenomena like sentience, we can have the same kind of conversation about culture. It's just saying, well, this is how I define it, and so do they do it or not? And rather than get stuck on that and not make any progress, let's just talk about what they argue.
Sure. So, I mean, I think I agree with what Mary Lee was just saying, that the question about what counts as a language and whether this is a language or not, even Chomsky has said, it's a question of how well the analogy fits. And the question of how well the analogy fits is going to depend on what you're using the word to do. So instead of getting into the question of what is language, just like with what is, if animals have language, if animals have a theory of mind, let's be more precise about the kind of elements that we're interested in. So we can ask things like, oh, do animals use symbolic communication? Do animals use gestural communication? Do animals use a vocal communication, right? So what modalities are used? Are these modalities things that seem to be under intentional control, or do we have some neuroscientific evidence that they're not under voluntary control? Then we can also look at what Charles Hockett calls the design features of language. What is language for? What are the different things human language allows us to do? Are there needs for the organism to do those sorts of things? So one of the things humans often lack is a shared frame of reference. And so we need to explain things to one another. Why did you do this? Oh, I did it because this is what happened. Oh, now I understand. But if you're living together all the time, you've got a shared frame of reference. You don't need to fill in all the details all the time. Everyone understands each other. There's not this why question that's arising constantly that needs to be dealt with. Reference to distal or non-existent entities. You can see that in a lot of non-human animals with alarm cries, for example. I didn't see it, but I heard that you saw it, so I'm going to run away or behave appropriately. So I think that's a much more useful way to approach the question of language, is by not talking about language, but talking about communication, functions of communication, and elements of communication.
Yes, hi. What I hear very often about a human is that we describe ourselves as a cultural animal, and some social biologists even believe that culture pushed our biology to its limit. So I wanted your opinions about animal in the wild with who we haven't interacted. Do they have a sort of culture like we describe it?
I can respond to that in terms of what chimps are doing, and I think this is probably going to be a big topic tomorrow, maybe. And again, it gets into how you define culture. No, chimpanzees do not have the opera. No, they don't have art museums, okay? So if that's what you're talking about, no ballet, although little chimps pirouette when they're playing. If you define culture by the way that we do things and the way that a community does things, we see evidence for communities of chimps using tools in particular ways, using gestures in particular ways. And so they have ways that they do things, hunting, differences in how they hunt. And so I'll just leave it at that.
Thank you.
And I think it goes beyond chips.
Yeah, absolutely.
I agree.
Yeah.
So can I ask a follow-up question about that on chimps, other primates, voles, and worms? So we've got all this great stuff on cultural traditions that differ between groups in many different species. I don't know about worms, but these are things that Christina Bicchieri would call descriptive norms. So these are just different ways individuals of these cultures act. But I'm really interested in whether these are also social norms. And social norms have the property of they're shared in the community, they're usually socially learned. But then there's also this expectation that others will also conform. And then there's a sanctioning element. If you don't conform, there's some negative result to lack of conformity. So is there any evidence of anything that looks like a social norm that you think of in any of the primates or the voles or not the worms?
It's going to depend on how you define it, but I mean, we do see things like, there are limits on how aggressive of an attack that an alpha male should have on, say, a subordinate male who just mated with a female, and you will see third-party interventions. Now, they're limited because without any form of hate to use the word language after that, but complex language where I can go and say, hey, did you see what Kristin did to me yesterday? You can't have third-party interventions that don't happen outside of the here and now, because you really do need a very precise language for that. But we do see those sorts of things. So there's big debate about whether or not it counts as a social norm. Seems like there's got at least some elements of it. You do see the sanctioning by third parties that are often uninvolved. It does seem to be something that the whole group together seems to form a consensus on. Often there will be hooting or something. So certainly it's possible.
And then maybe, the work that's been done with conformity, right, in labs, and I'm not up on it enough. So the work, there's been work done on conformity, and maybe you're more familiar with that. I
mean, they tend to conform to what other members of their group are doing. So for instance, just to give one quick example, my postdoc, Lydia Hopper, and I did a study years ago where we trained chimps we trained a model chimp that one token was worth a fairly low value food and one token was worth a high value food. And then we let all the other chimps out to interact with the tokens. And even though they all experienced trading the token that was worth the high value food, they all followed the model and traded the token that was worth the low value food. So we argued that was conformity. You're doing what the other individual in your group does, even when you have personal direct experience, that this one has what appears to be an objectively better payoff. So they do seem to have, and they show there's evidence of prestige bias and things like that. So, but again, it comes down to definitions.
But once we get that definition, if we accept this definition, then yeah.
I would argue that yes, there is some evidence of social
And
norms.
what about in other primates?
Not as much. You don't see as much third-party intervention and so forth. But there are some cases, some arguments for it, and you do see conformity and prestige bias in other species.
So one of my favorite studies recently on culture is the Erika van der Waals work with the Capuchin monkeys. So she was just interested in seeing, first of all, if infants, and I know you know this, I'm explaining it to them, to the people who don't know it. She was interested to figure out whether infants learn to get the same preferences as their mothers. She thought they would, but she was studying this. So what she did is provision these 4 communities of wild vervet monkeys with corn. Some corn was dyed blue, some corn was dyed pink. And in 2 of these communities, the blue corn was made to taste disgusting, and the other 2, the pink corn, was made to taste disgusting. The mothers, the whole community were exposed to the corn. They developed preferences. Then they stopped making all the corn disgusting, right? So then once the infants are born, they could eat whatever they wanted. Nothing tasted disgusting, but they would tend to share the preference with their community. But then what was really cool is that when the infants grew up and immigrated, the blue corn eaters moved to pink corn communities and pink corn eaters moved to blue corn communities, and they switched their preferences in all cases except for one case where the monkey who switched became the alpha immediately. And so I think this is a great example of something that really looks like a social norm and a drive for a social norm, because what you see is a behavior that is not functional at all if you're just looking at gaining nutrition. I knew this food is safe. I've eaten it my whole life, but I'm going to stop eating this and instead compete for this other food that everybody else wants, because that's what the cool kids are doing.
The infant one, there's good evolutionary reason for that. You should eat what your mother eats because she probably knows more than you. Hopefully. But then when you transitioned, it was a beautiful study. Yeah.
So is there anything else on vervet monkey besides that too? Or is that...
They're doing a whole bunch of work looking at various social learning things, and I don't remember any of them off the top of my head, but of course, because I'm on the spot. But yeah, she's been following up on that, and they've got some fantastic studies where they're looking at feeding in different boxes and how they change their preferences.
Cool. And Voles, is there anything like sanctioning, conformity, culture?
I mean, again, like how you define these things, but even with loose definitions of what you mean, I think that you'd be hard pressed to point to something that one could call a tradition in a vole. I mean, my PhD supervisor studied for many years food preferences in rats and the cultural transmission of that sort of thing. I suspect you could get those kinds of things in voles as well. No one has looked at that, but that would just be, I think, a rodent general kind of behavior. And so to the extent that level of social learning could be sort of chalked up to something like that, then yeah, maybe. But short answer is no one has looked at that or asked that question. I'm unaware of anything that would sort of fit the mold. I was trying to think about something when you were talking. I don't think so.
And one thing we should say is that a lot of these smart behaviors aren't just going to be in apes. We tend to study apes, and apes are easier for us to study because we can keep them in our own environments as opposed to, say, cetaceans, which have to be kept in a tank of water, and It's hard for us to get to them. But elephants and cetaceans and things like that are also very highly encephalized, and they're very long-lived and highly cooperative, highly social. You would expect to see the same sorts of things.
And we're actually looking for...
The birds and the squirrels on YouTube.
The squirrel that purrs.
Oh, the squirrel that purrs.
Oh.
I have not, but...
all right, I'll Google that one.
But I have children, so I should look that up.
Yeah. I just wanted to say that I'm working with No Miller right now, and we're running a rat study that's trying to see if we can replicate this Erika van der Waal study using Galef's cinnamon cocoa system. But we're creating 4 different communities where we're having 2 of them like cocoa by putting a little sugar in it and a little quinine in the cinnamon, and then flipping it for the other 2 communities. Then we're going to introduce naives, put them in there once the food all tastes fine, and then flip them from a cocoa community to a cinnamon community. Cool. And who knows what's going to happen? Might go horribly wrong, but yeah, we need to do this sort of stuff on a variety of species and not just assume, this is a fancy primate thing.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah, and I guess I think that's awesome, and I think it's a beautiful empirical question. I'm glad to hear you're doing it. On the one hand, I would say we do need to. I think that there's not necessarily something unique to these kinds of things to primates, and the capacity for these sorts of things is almost certainly not just the highly encephalized sort of megafauna that you mentioned, Sarah, but others as well. On the other hand, the capacity to do something and the natural expression of it are 2 different things that we also want to keep in mind at some level. Yeah. To get back to the question I think that you had at one point earlier about, I think it was Stephen who was talking about why don't chips talk if they can talk, right? And being able to do something and having the natural sort of tendency to do something are not necessarily 2 things. I mean, if an alien race came and taught us a human to do something that was very ahuman, we might be able to do it, but would we naturally do it and all of that? I think these are slightly different questions. So having that capacity and then having the natural tendency, important points to just keep in mind in general. But I do suspect that there would be things that fit cultural, transmissional themes in rodents and other species.
Let me just follow up.
And birds, absolutely, yeah.
I just want to sort of follow up on that because, with this idea that nature is conservative in a sense. So, if we can design an experiment where we see a behavior and it is, maybe it is there and maybe it is there in a natural sense. We just don't have the lens to see that occurring. Because I would say, well, then why the heck do they have the capacity to do it? Nature isn't like that, is it? I mean, we don't go around with unused, or organisms don't go around with unused capacities.
Well, yes and no, right? So they do and they don't, right? Obviously, there's this idea that why waste? I mean, you don't want to take this. I don't like to take this hyper conservative approach that we have everything that we have is adaptive and that's it, and we don't have anything that's just not necessarily maladaptive, but just non-adaptive. I mean,
extra.
Yeah, and I think that that's not necessarily true. I think that you can't get innovation, you can't get evolutionary innovations, if you don't have some raw material to work on, and having a little bit of that noise in some individuals of the population allow you to have that. So having the capacity for something and then putting it into a context where it can then be realized and then become adaptive could lead to the evolution of something like that. It's not to say that evolution has any intention, but at some level, organisms at a sort of meta level would benefit by having that degree of individual variation such that those innovations can happen. And from the individual perspective, so to avoid the group selection kind of viewpoint here, which I personally don't love, at an individual level, being a little bit different, you never know when being that different is going to help. And if it doesn't hurt, then have that capacity. And if it does help, then it can be taken advantage of. So I think that it's not a total waste to be able to do something that you don't do, if that was kind of what you were getting at.
Well, and I guess to me, I hear what you're saying about individual differences and variation in behavior and variations in individuals within a population. You've got to have that, right? Mm-hmm. But then if there's a capacity that all of the individuals in that population have and they're not using it, I guess that's what I'm asking about. It's like, and that to me is something very different than individuals coming out there.
And I think then it would come down to what the costs are of having that ability and not using it would be. Because if the cost is minimal, then why not have it and not use it? And if the cost is high, then don't have it.
Right. So it looks like there are questions.
I have a question as well, actually. So I guess knowing everything that we know about animal sentience on different levels and different species, we've seen it start to affect legislation a little bit more recently than, it's happening very, very slowly. But how do you think, I guess, it will affect legislation in the future and how it should affect legislation in the future? Maybe it's something that'll be addressed more in the discussion tonight about the precautionary principle, but do you have an opinion on how it should affect how we interact with animals, how they live within our society? I don't know if any of you have read Zoopolis, but kind of on that notion.
You're the philosopher.
Insofar as one makes arguments for legal protection based on psychological properties and maybe relationship properties as well, the way Sue and Will would have us do, then you have to convince the legal establishment that these things matter, and then you need the science to show that these properties actually exist in the species. And last night I was talking about why it's important to not exaggerate the capacities that non-human animals have in order to try to achieve this goal, and that sometimes I see that happening. I see claims that I don't think are justified by the current science. Not that some of these claims I think are false, but they're just not currently justified. So we need to be careful about that. That's what I want to say right now.
Well, and I would imagine it gets right back into that. It gets right back into that definition thing, because the law, has a completely different language than science does. And I'm sure tomorrow this will be a topic tomorrow night, but just that creates a whole lot of problems as well. And look, even just among science, there's no agreement on what these things are and what we should call them. But then when you move into a different discipline, it's even more difficult.
I think what you're getting at about the differences between science and law become very important, because we also don't understand each other's rules of evidence and the language we use to describe it. And you hear of cases, I have lawyer friends who are in court, and when something is cited as this was a peer-reviewed study, they mean that to mean it's true, when of course we in court. So they're trying to establish truth claims from science, whereas scientists, we see science as provisional, and we're getting less uncertain, but we're probably not making strong truth claims about things. And I think that these traditions don't have good ways of communicating to each other. And
Yeah, we need more science education in our culture generally. That's what I would say. And the journalists don't always help.
You should do the audience questions.
Well, I think I'll pass because I'm off topic completely now, and I think I want to hear more about that.
Okay, I'll try to put that because it's chaos. Like I have notes all over the place, and like it's too much. In my name, I'm not there for credit, but I'm Camille. Yeah, so it's like just too much information since this morning. Like very very interesting, but like too much for my brain to process everything. So I just want to go back to Stephen's question, like if chimps can talk, why don't they say more? And I'd like to hear you about that because, so I don't know what you think, but Tomasello seems to convey the message that chimps mostly communicate in an imperative way, like to ask for things, but they don't communicate that much in a declarative way, like to share their mental states or things like that. And he said, like, so he basically turns it into a question of motivation, like the motivation to cooperate, to share the feelings and things like that. Instead, they're more competitive and not so much cooperative. And so I'd like to have your opinion on that. And also, so from what I understand, and it's not my field, so I might be off topic, but I have the impression that actually great apes might not have the ability to communicate that much, because it seems to me that the things that's powerful in language, the things that allow us to say so much, so many different things, is that, how to say that? Like there's like the double articulation things that, you know, like there's a limited number of sounds in every language, but that we can combine them in like different, like with syntax, like the rules to combine those different sounds allow us to say like many different things from like a restrictive subtract, a limited number of sounds. And so I have, from what I understand, it's that great apes have the ability to combine a few signs, but not that many, and their syntactic rules are not so elaborated. So that's why they would, that's why they would have some capacity to say a few things, but not that many different things. And so I'd like to have your opinion on that. And also, last thing, so like there's also that like regarding language, like there's that one distinctive feature seems to be like that words are arbitrary, like in the sense that there's no, like the words don't resemble what they refer to. And yeah, I'd like to hear you on this and the link between arbitrary symbols, like if great apes use them, how often, and the link between this and social norms as well. I don't know if it's clear.
Yeah, so I'll just start with the first one, and I'll just reiterate, we need more science education. If people were educated about science, they would know what's wrong with Michael Tomasello's work. He often, he does a lot of comparative work with human children and apes. And in some experiments, for example, the human child is sitting in mom's lap during the trial, and the chimp is sitting inside of a cage. And then we can ask, where has the chimp been all of his or her life? And where has the child been all of his or her life? So, you know, you all often end up with the chimps not doing as well as the children, but I would ask about looking at the methodology, because it's not a comparative paradigm. So,
sorry, can I just
yep.
piggyback very smallly on that? Another point to criticize those methods is when you have a baby sitting on a mama's lap, the mamas are rarely blinded to what are happening, and mamas could be giving babies cues as well. So
Yeah,
just to underscore that point.
There used to be video online that actually showed some cueing of a parent and a kid in one of those comparative studies, and that got taken down.
And the kids are getting tons of verbal scaffolding, which is one of my pet peeves, since I don't give any of the any instruction to my humans. And the kids are getting tons of verbal scaffolding from the experimenter and from the parents, and the chimps aren't.
So now for the next one, your next question. I don't have my glasses. That was the one about.
That was whether or not they can make the sounds and combine multiple symbols together, and then the third one was arbitrary.
Oh, okay. Yeah. So first of all, let me clarify. Chimps don't talk. Chimps can't talk. Experiments were done, and the chimps failed miserably at that. They can gesture because they have hands. So with signs, you have sharemes, which are analogous to phonemes and signs, and you combine sharemes to create signs. And then with grammatical techniques in ASL, you can change aspects of sharemes to change the sign itself. And we see the chimps doing that. So I can change the place where signs are made to change the meaning of the sign. Actually, wild chimps do that as well with their gestures. I can do this as a directed scratch, and the partner will groom me there, versus if I do this, then the partner grooms me there. So they're conveying meaning in those interactions. It's the same kind of thing. So, am I ready for the next one? For your next one? Unless you want to.
But isn't their capacity to combine signs kind of limited in a way? Can they combine many signs?
Yeah. So they combine. Some of the phrases are up to 18 signs long. So they combine the signs into novel ways, and really, are they meaningful, right? Or is it just word salad? So yes, they combine them into phrases, and they are, and some of the utterances are multiple signs long. It's just not one or two signs together.
Can you give an English translation of a long chimpanzee phrase?
Give me that banana there. It's, if you look in the literature, some of them are quite long. But if you're asking about the kinds of things they're signing about, a lot of it is, they are in a dependent situation, so we have to look at the context of their conversations. And so they do usually talk about the events. If you're dependent on someone for food, that is a big event. If you go into a nursing home, I'll bet you a lot of the conversations are about food. They're going to be about hygiene, the daily routine, those kinds of activities. That's what's relevant. I don't know of any research. I'm dying to do it, to look at the quality of conversations that are based in institutionally housed individuals, humans, versus those that are living in a community setting, and you're probably going to get similar kinds of differences. So I think I got off on a tangent.
Can I just chime in on something on that while you? Yeah. So when I was working with the Rehabilitate orangutans in Borneo, these were animals that had lost their mums and then were going back into the forest in a forest school setting. So they were being provisioned by humans and cared for by humans, but they were also learning what sort of food to process, what sort of food to eat, how to process it, how to climb trees without breaking them and hurting themselves, all sorts of things. And they had demonstrators of the human babysitters. And these orangutans would come up to us. They didn't know that I'm an idiot and don't know anything about the Bornean forest and what to eat, but they would come up to me and to others and show me the food in their mouth. So they stick their lower lip out, because you don't need to put it on your hand, but to show me what was in their mouth. And stupidly, I put my hand out and they gave me the stuff, and then I just threw it down. And the response was frustration, picking up those items and giving them back to me as if wanting me to do something or give them some sort of okay. And this is something that the babysitters reported that these orangutans did quite often. So they were showing, like, this is just they weren't requesting, maybe they were requesting some information, but they were showing these objects, and these objects they were important for some reason. So then different sorts of contexts are going to get different sorts of communicative signals, I think, in a, what do I eat? How do I learn how to do this situation versus I'm here, give me this stuff that I know you have situation.
Yeah. And I mean, that's not to say that they also wouldn't use signs to start play interactions. They sign to each other about, and those conversations usually are more about social interactions rather than about food. So about grooming, about initiating play, seeking reassurance from other individuals. And then the last question about arbitrariness, and people have argued this about sign language, that American Sign Language is not an arbitrary language. But some people would argue that spoken languages aren't arbitrary. You know, high frontal consonants and high vowels correlate with small things. And things that are large in size usually are vowels that are occurring lower in the back of your throat. They're deeper sounds. So does that make spoken language not arbitrary? I guess the real arbitrariness would come out of the language projects that use lexigrams, so they're just symbols. It's analogous to reading, and that's arbitrary, and so they can attach a arbitrary symbol with an object or an action or a marker.
And if I can add to that, the lexigram trained animals were trained after some of the initial sign language training had started and people had started to make this arbitrary argument. So they actually intentionally chose symbols that were completely arbitrary in order to make sure that they didn't get the same criticism. Not because they were critical of the sign language, previous sign language apes, but because they wanted to make sure that that criticism couldn't be levied. And they learned it just fine.
I got really curious about Sarah when you talked about the prestige bias, and so I wanted to know like how you I wanted to hear you more about that, and how would you describe prestige? Is it like completely related to dominance or popularity? Is it only the same thing, or is it peer pressure? If a lot of monkeys start imitating that one, then other ones will follow, or it's more like personal social preferences, or so I'd like to hear you more about that, and which species do have a prestige bias and conformity, if it's like apes or monkeys or others. Thank you.
Sure. So I haven't been following this literature very carefully, so apologies in advance. I may well forget something important. So if I forget somebody in here's study, I don't mean it on purpose. So most of the studies have been done looking experimentally. So train one individual and see if they get followed and imitated by other individuals in the group. And usually that is a relatively high-ranking individual in the group. Often it's not actually the alpha male because not everyone can get all that close to the alpha male. So often it's the alpha female. So in a lot of the studies with chimpanzees that were done with the group led by Franz de Waal and Andy Whiten, and Vicky Horner and Kristen Bonney and some other people were really involved in this work, they usually chose the alpha female. But individuals tend to follow the more dominant one. They tend to follow individuals who seem to know what's going on. So if you pull one out and train them, then they're more likely to imitate that individual who seems to have the training. So the interesting thing is there is some evidence in primates that the primates recognize that even a low-ranking individual can sometimes have specialized knowledge. And so they are more likely to follow that. They're more likely to pay attention to that individual. There have been some arguments that that's not the same thing as prestige as what you see in humans, and this gets back to the definitional thing because it's just dominance or it's just rank. rather than really prestige in the sense of, oh, this is a well-respected individual. Because in humans, you can dissociate prestige and rank or prestige and dominance. It's really hard to do that in the primates, in part because in captivity, a lot of times these groups are fairly small. And the other thing is, anytime we give artificial prestige by special training, we're actually changing quite a lot because we've just made that individual special by pulling them in. But I mean, I think that the fact that in a lot of these individuals, they will go against their own best interests in order to follow what other individuals in their group are doing. So whether it's conformity, like what Erika van der Waals' study was indicating, or whether it's because, so are they conforming with the group? Are they copying the dominant group member? We can't tell for sure, but they seem to be following some strategy other than just, I'm going to do what's best for me. We should probably ask Simon tomorrow. He probably knows much more about this than I do. But it's been demonstrated in both apes and in monkeys.
And just one last follow-up question. You said that even if you train, I understand that's like really like changing a lot of their natural, like changing a lot. But like when you train a lower status individual into having more knowledge, and you said the other monkeys or apes will recognize that this lower ranked monkey has something maybe to show to the group. Do you know if this monkey could gain a bit in ranking or be more groomed, or I don't want to say respected, but like
so there was a study.
Does it change its status?
There's a study. It was with long-tailed macaques, and I cannot remember who did it. I think it was Charlotte Hemmelreich. And this was from a long time ago, back in the 80s, where they trained a fairly low-ranking macaque to use an apparatus which brought food out. And when the apparatus was out and active and she was getting food from it, her status temporarily was quite a bit higher. But as soon as they couldn't get food out of it, her status dropped back down. So it was a very specific situational sort of thing, very much like in a lot of primate species, they are very attracted to infants. So individuals who have infants gain status immediately just because they have their infant. But again, it's just in the context where they have that infant, and the minute it grows up and there's no longer a baby there, they lose their status. So it doesn't seem like this is changing anything over the long term. It's just a very specific situational tweak.
Thank you very much.
Mm-hmm.
Hi, my name is Jeremy Bust. So the idea was mentioned that there's no strict line between conscious and unconscious animals, but is there a practical ethical line between animals that deserve ethical treatment and ones that don't? And how would you go about drawing that line?
I'll start. The worm guy. So I think, so I don't think there are any real bright lines between conscious, unconscious, sentient, non-sentient. But the decision of whether there can be a practical line is just a question of do we want one, right? So we can make a practical line. The question is, are there objective criteria that can inform that practical line? I'm not sure. I think that this line is going to be a hard one to find. And it's not clear to me what kind of evidence goes into it. Is it anatomical? Is it behavioral? Does it have something to do with the ecology or life history traits of that organism? Some people said, well, an animal with a 3-day life cycle, what's really at stake here? An animal that has 300 offspring at a time. So the kind of thing I do. But then it obviously gets more complicated as you go up and up. So I see the value of a practical line. We have a practical line now, and the question is, should it be moved? And I think there's every reason to always reconsider moving it. But I myself don't know what kind of objective criteria go into that.
So I'll try and wade into this one a little as well and say that that line, I think that there's disagreement about where these lines are, because these are getting into the legal world. These are legal definitions usually, or at some level legal-like, where they're imposed by governmental regulatory groups and other sorts of groups that are interested in things like ethics and morality. And as a member of the human species, I ascribe to the value of those sorts of things. But I think at some level, just sort of stepping back outside of our species for a minute, keeping in mind that maybe an interesting big question just to consider is morality above and beyond a particular species? In other words, did humans create morality and then we're trying to impose our rules on that? Would a chimp have a sense of morality? And where would they draw the line, for example? Just something to think about and play with for a minute. But back to your question, where do we draw the line? I mean, first of all, is consciousness the line you want to use? And what does consciousness mean? Is pain, suffering the line you want to use? And if so, where do you draw the line? And then what objective measures can you use for that? And you have a general, I think, consensus of where most people say this is clearly where the line ought to be. And then one person, so one of my very good friends is an author and a vegan, and he writes about these sorts of things, and he talks a lot about things like animal rights. And for him, eating an animal is not acceptable, but many of us in the room probably don't have a problem with that. And so there are individual variations of where people draw those lines. And I think that having some level of objectivity and knowing what it is that we are trying to accomplish, I think is a really important point. And the regulatory groups that think about these things to put in some basic protections, think about these things very deeply and are often frequently revising these things, and sometimes it gets pushed. Usually it goes in one direction, not the other. In other words, more and more protections. Usually it doesn't go less and less. But that is something that is constantly being revisited and thought about. I think it's an important issue. I don't know if anyone has the right answer.
And just to kind of follow up a little bit, I mean, that's it, that concept of, whether you eat meat or not, but even just within that, some people would never eat dogs, right? Because dogs are things that live in their house. But, so, and that's back to the line drawing and where people draw the lines. Or maybe they don't eat beef, but they wear leather shoes. So, yeah.
Hi, my name is Daika Brousseau-Généreux, and I was just wondering, so I heard you say that it had to go through science education to make the change in people's mind. But I was wondering if you could define it, because I don't think science right now is changing something when we know it. So I've been talking with people, and a lot of people know or think, I should say, that cows and chickens and pigs suffer from slaughterhouses processing, and they know that this industry is killing billions of animals, and they recognize that there is suffering, but they wouldn't give up bacon or steak. So I'm wondering what science could change in people's mind in that order.
So this is a really interesting point, because just as a side point, you're bringing up effectively the agricultural side of the world. And the types of regulations and ethics issues that people in those domains have to deal with are dramatically relaxed compared to the kinds of regulations that the science world deals with, in a way that can be kind of perversely funny when you've got a person who works in fisheries and can do something that is just, if you work with a fish and you're a scientist, you've got to build special apparatus to house an animal and yada, yada. But if you are raising fish, you can just basically take them out and hit them with a mallet. I mean, that's not actually reality, but the difference in the things are just dramatic, and it's really striking. So from that perspective already, there are different regulations just on the nature of the work that's done. But your question is about what can science do to inform these rules, and when should they be standardized and all of that. I mean, first and foremost, I will echo the point. We as scientists are all dramatically failing in reaching out and explaining our science to the general public in ways that we need to. And in part, that's just the nature of the problem. We get involved in our work and then we focus on that. We don't take that next step. We need to do that better. I think that there can be lessons in science. There are some people whose sole careers are dedicated to understanding these things. Marion Stamp Dawkins is a good example of this. Of course, oh my gosh, I can't believe I'm blanking on her name, very famous, Colorado State.
Temple Grandin.
Thank you, Temple Grandin, very, very well known for these sorts of things. And they are doing a good job of sort of trying to equalize and promote these things. There is money and big business involved. And when you want to talk about costs and benefits, when you have big lobbying firms saying animal rights are all great, but don't mess with my bottom line in agribusiness and sort of that, you get that pushback. I don't know the right answer. I think that, again, as Michael said, defining some really clear basic criteria that you can point to that are that are sort of that have biological basis and meaning can be something that science can serve to do. And then how people want to use it and interpret it and lobby it, that's the next step out. That's a deeper moral question.
So, okay.
I just want to say...
I can say two sentences. My 2 sentences are that if the question is, can science tell us how to move from people accepting some sort of moral truth to behaving in a way consistent with that belief, that, yeah, scientists are studying this. And it's the same as, like, how do we get people to quit smoking when they know that smoking's bad for them? I was trying to remember his name, I can't, but there's someone at U of T in the business school studying this stuff, and at the University of Toronto. So that's a different interpretation of the question, but that's something scientists can and do study.
Well, I just want to thank all of our panelists once again. And if I'm not mistaken, the next session is at 7:30.